to drive your career, not just ride along? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Power of Owning Your Career podcast. I'm Simone E. Morris, your host and career strategist, here to give you the roadmap. Each week, we're cutting through the noise with strategies, stories, and insights to get you back in control. Your career clarity starts right here. Welcome to the show. Today, we're joined by Dan Castle, a seasoned leader with over 25 years of experience across healthcare and finance. From leading massive tech teams to working on the cutting edge of cybersecurity sales, Dan brings a truly unique perspective. But that's just the beginning. With a background in psychology, philosophy, and organizational dynamics, and a passion for education, Dan is here to share his insights. Get ready to dive deep and welcome Dan Castle to the show.
Thanks for having me, Simone. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So, Dan, let me go back. When you were growing up, what did you want to be?
You know, it's so funny you asked that question because it is a conversation I have with my own children today. And what I wanted to be was some combination of a NASA astronaut and a basketball player. Now, for
Wow.
those of you listening, I'm not taller than 5'9", so basketball was probably never in the cards. And it turns out to be an astronaut, you have to be really good at physics and at math, which are probably two of my weaker subjects. So those two did not pan out as I intended.
Now, wait a minute. I don't know basketball that much. I hope I don't bumble and stumble with this, but was it Muggsy Bogues, or there are short people that are played and 5'9" is not that, you
There are.
know.
Yeah. So the one professional that I admired growing up was a gentleman named Spud Webb, and he was short. I think he was probably under 5'5" or 5'6". But I think it's interesting you say that because I think today's game is very different. My children follow the NBA more than I do. But when
hmm
you look at folks like Stephen Curry, probably one of the biggest names in the NBA, he has figured out a way to overcome his, I'll call it a height limitation compared to some of the other players in the league. And I think that's probably apropos for our conversation today because it's about identifying where his strengths are and maximizing those strengths and sort of minimizing the areas that other would consider weaknesses that has allowed Stefan, in addition to just a relentless pursuit of his craft, to rise to the sort of level that he's at today in the game.
So inspiring. I'm not a sports person, but I must admit, since the Olympics, I've been inspired by sports and some of the athletes, just what goes into really being in the driver's seat to talk about this podcast. So tell us a little bit before we jump into the meat of the interview. Tell us a little bit about your work and what you're currently doing. I did share your bio in the beginning, but tell us a little bit from your perspective, what you're currently doing.
Sure. So I currently work today in a field called customer success. And customer success is all about helping customers achieve value with whatever product they've invested in. And that can be a product that's of a hardware variety or a software variety. It's an interesting field for me, Simone, because it allows me to combine both a love for technology with a love for organizational understanding and organizational dynamics. And really, at the bottom of both of those two aspects is an understanding of people. Why is it that people make the decisions that they do? Why is it that people look for certain outcomes in their particular investment, whether that's an investment in financial reasons, as it is in my full-time job, but it could also be an investment in their time. Why do people spend time in education? Why do people spend time in social? So for me, it's a great way to bring together a number of different streams and a number of different things that I have found interesting over the years. I've done a number of different things in my career. I'm almost at the 30-year mark professionally, and I've worked as an individual contributor. I've worked as a leader in different organizations. I've worked for some public companies. I've worked for some private companies. I've worked in companies as small as 95 people and as big as 12,000 people. And so I've sort of had a very a varied career in every step of the way, always looking for what can I learn where I am and how do I pivot that into something that I don't quite have a full qualification for, but I have enough of a background and enough of an appetite to be interesting and hopefully make a dent that's a little different than perhaps somebody who comes from a more traditional background.
I am curious about the last comment that you made about the pivoting in your career when you don't have a lot of experience, and how you're able to sell yourself and
Mhm.
how to use those transferable skills. Let's go there first and really talk about how, what would you say to our listeners who want to package up their skill set? They want to do a pivot, but they don't have, the traditional list of things that people are asking for in the job description. How have you done it, and any tips there?
Sure. So I think there's probably two things that I would bring out. The first is don't underestimate the power of networking. Many of the careers that I've had have been jobs that maybe were never advertised publicly in the traditional ways that we think about careers being offered. They're the result of connections of people that I've either worked with in the past or I've interacted with in conferences or in various professional ways. The other is take advantage of the interview, right? When you have an interview with a prospective employer, you really want to stand out. You want to make yourself different and unique so that when that conversation ends, most of those today are over Zoom, right? They're not face to face like they were back in the day. But you want that interviewer to really say, wow, that person was interesting. There's something about Simone Morris that's just different. And for me, the way to do that is to think about how do I address the questions and the problems at hand in a way that is not algorithmic. Let's put it that way.
Mm.
And for me, that's about preparing for those interviews. It's about understanding what the company is, understanding what the problem is, and then finding a way to draw parallels between what I've done and where my education lies, along with my aspirations, and putting that in business value terms to the prospective employer. So, for
Mm.
example, in customer success, it's all about value, which translates into renewals and into upsells. So, for me, I can leverage the experience I have in teaching, let's say, or in understanding the power dynamic, which is part of the things that I've studied as a graduate student, to answer questions around how would you work with a customer that is on the cusp of expanding versus how would you save a customer that's on the cusp of churning, i.e., not renewing. And so understanding the dynamic of the organization or understanding the dynamic of the person may not be part of the job description as it is stated verbatim, but I think that's the unique perspective that all of us can bring if we are able to leverage our experience and leverage our knowledge in a way that's very um, dynamic or perhaps very disruptive in a positive way.
Mm. I love the word disrupt. Yes, so it sounds a lot like research. Do your homework, be well prepared. How does one bolster the skill set, of career strategy? Because what you're talking about is really being memorable in
Mhm.
spaces, whether it's leveraging network. You mentioned the power of networking. You mentioned really doing your due diligence so that you show up well prepared and you disrupt so that you're memorable. So when I bring that all together, I think career strategy.
Mhm.
What resource can you think of that has helped you to hone in on the problem statement, or showing up and showcasing your value? What are some of the resources that help you to show up and be different and memorable?
Yeah, so I think there are three things that come to mind. The first is one particular book that I've read, and for those of you who may be watching this on video, you can see a large bookcase behind me. I'm an avid reader. I'm someone who reads both fiction and nonfiction to sort of pick out different pieces that I find useful and then find a way to stitch them together in a way that's perhaps different or unique. And one book that stands out to answer in direct answer to your question, Simone, is Give and Take by Adam Grant. And one of the things that Adam talks about in Give and Take is that people are more than willing to offer help if others are willing to ask for it. And it's an interesting sort of dynamic where people are willing to help one another, but only if they're asked and if they're asked for that specific help. So we have to overcome this fear of saying, I don't know enough about this area, or I don't know enough about this company. Find somebody in our network or find somebody that we can relate with and say, can you help me? Can you help me understand how this language works? Can you help me understand what the regulations are in this industry? Along with that, and we're living in a time in 2025 where AI is continuing to be front and center. I've done some work with specifically with ChatGPT, where if you pay ChatGPT and sort of get a pro configuration with ChatGPT. It's a minimal amount of money. I think it's $20 a month. What ChatGPT does is it gives you the ability to create your own large language model or LLM. And so what I've done recently is I've fed my own LLM with a series of things like job descriptions for particular companies that sound interesting. And I've given ChatGPT the instruction to function as if they were an interviewer, to read that job description and to ask me specific questions about that job description. And then once I've typed my response, to give me critical feedback about whether my response is good enough or how it could be improved. And so making technology work for us as opposed to being a slave to it is another good piece of this puzzle to me. The final piece would be, again, and I keep coming back to this, but I really do believe in it, is the power of networking, right? One of the biggest advantages, in my view, for platforms like LinkedIn, which is actually how you and I met through a mutual friend,
Yes.
is just reaching out to people and saying, you know what, I have an interview at such and such a company. I don't know anybody there, but I see you do. You have a connection to someone at the target company, what LinkedIn would call a second connection or a third connection. Can you make an introduction for me? And getting that warm handover or getting that warm intro is incredibly important to sort of getting the door open to beat the 600, 700,000 applications that often are submitted for the same type of job. So I think if we think about Dr. Grant or Adam Grant's sort of encouragement to ask for help when we have it, if we use some of the technology at our disposal, like the ability to create an artificial, in quotes, interviewer that can give you very targeted, very specific feedback, and if we're not afraid to say, can you make an introduction for me? Those I think are three of the important pieces for me that hopefully are useful to others in overcoming some of those obstacles. Now that just opens the door, right? Once the door is open, now you still have to show up and be that interesting person. And there's, sort of different ways we can talk about how that might be something that people can strive for.
I love that you're going to the place of next level interviewing or leveraging technology. I have a tech background, so I spent a number of years in the tech space, and I love the AI. One of the things I did, listeners, is Cornell has an AI strategy course, and because I didn't really know enough about it, and listen, you got to get on get on board, or you get left behind,
Mhm.
right? So you've got to start leveraging AI, and I love, Dan, that you gave us a real example of how to creatively use it. And I'm thinking too, if you're inside an organization and you're going for a promotion or you're
Mhm.
going up for jobs, this is a useful tool to use for additional research to help you own your career.
Absolutely. No, I think those are great ideas. And specifically, what I would give listeners the guidance to do, there are a number of people in this field that I think are sort of on the vanguard in AI. And two that come to mind would be Ethan Mollick, who's a researcher at the University of Pennsylvania, and the other one is a gentleman named Jeremy Utley. Jeremy was a former professor at the Stanford D School on design thinking. He was part of a class that I took there, and so I've begun to follow both of those gentlemen on LinkedIn, and they publish material quite regularly that I find fascinating and interesting around AI and how to use AI to be an advantage and really leverage it and leverage its capabilities.
I love that. And listeners, we will put in the show notes those names so that you can leverage LinkedIn, LinkedIn plus AI. And I find following people, they're always dropping gems. Most people strive to add value on the LinkedIn platform. So it is like going to school, even if you're not, there's always a resource or some post that's informative if you make the time to consume that information. Now, Dan, let's go to the place of owning your career. This
Mhm.
show is about really being in the driver's seat. We don't suggest that, we don't subscribe to that you're never in the passenger seat because at one point or another, some of us end up in the passenger seat as well. But we encourage people to really be hands-on and intentional and strategic in their careers. Hence the message around really being in the driver's seat for your career. I'd
Mhm.
love to know, well, first of all, when did you realize that you were in the driver's seat in your career?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there are two examples that I was thinking about before we started recording here today, Simone. And one occurred very early in my career. I was probably in my third or fourth year of work. I was in a technology role inside of a non-technology company. And I was dealing with a supervisor who was many years my senior. And we had some type of disagreement. I don't remember what the specifics were. But the response I got from that gentleman, who was my boss at the time, is that he demanded my respect. And I took issue with that. I said, respect is not something that you can demand. It's something that is earned. And it's something that you, at this particular moment, Mr. Manager, haven't earned. So you can't have my respect. And I remember taking that to our collective boss. And that person sat down and he heard both sides of that story. And in the end, what he told my boss was, you're wrong. And so as a young, sort of employee in this large company, I realized the power of standing up for oneself. And I realized the power of going forward when I knew that I was right. And there's a bit of a risk in there for sure. Looking back, I look back at my then 20 something year old self and I'm like, that was pretty brave, right? Times were different. I didn't have as many expenses. I didn't have a family to raise, right? So things were a little bit different. My tolerance for risk was different. But then fast forward several years later, I'm in another conversation with another manager, and we're going through a compensation cycle. So I'm sitting down with this manager, and they're about to give me my performance review for the prior year. And I was in a role where I was managing projects. And I remember saying to this individual, these projects were not successful. We did not finish three of the four or three of the five. And I've sort of filled you in on all of the specifics along the way throughout the year as to why, different resource constraints, different whatever the case may be. And this person looked at me and he said, that may all be true, but you didn't make me listen. And I said, excuse me? He says, you didn't make me listen. I took a step back. This is a face-to-face meeting, again, pre-COVID. And I said, that's pretty irresponsible of you. I can't make you do anything. You have to be the person that is open to that. I can only avail myself of giving you the various channels, whether it's through meetings or minutes, or this is predates Slack, so I think it was whatever the sort of online communication system was. And I wound up leaving that role and taking a different role in the same organization. But what that taught me, Simone, is again, integrity has to be everything. And in the absence of integrity, we have nothing. And what I realized at that point was I didn't really want to work for that person, and I wound up not working for that person, but I also didn't want to work at all for that particular type of manager. And what I learned in that moment is that everybody needs a good, bad example in their lives. What they need is someone to look at and say, when I'm given a chance to lead, I don't want to be that. I don't want to treat my people that way. And so I think it's a way, it's a mind shift that says I can take something that's overtly negative and I can find something positive in it as a result.
You have me thinking, two things came up for me. One is it reminded me of an experience where I spoke my mind in my youth, in my career, and it did not go well. It did not. In fact, I felt ostracized in that my career opportunities were limited because of my courage to speak up. So I do think that, you have to gauge your environment, culture, and that
Yes.
there are dynamics at play where privilege may enter the equation where you can speak freely without repercussions. As a Black woman, I'm just speaking from Simone's perspective, my experience when I went to that place, and it's that example that you remember, to your point, Dan, you remember, I remember that experience always about sticking up for myself and how I handled it. So thank you for bringing up that example. I'm really appreciative of that, that we need to get to a place where we can really stand in our truth. But you have to be ready for the risk or potential fallout with that. And I heard you allude to risk. So I want to ask you about risk. When you think about your career, what is your perspective now? I know you have a family, things are
Mhm.
different. What is your perspective on taking risk in your career?
Yeah, great question. And I've thought a lot about that. So my career, if it were to be mapped out on a piece of paper, would not be linear. It would look more like a roller coaster, right? With its ups and its downs. And so where I sit today in 2025, my risk is one that is firmly grounded in the values that I hold to be true. And this would be my advice to the listeners is really think about what values you have and let those be your guide as we live in these very uncertain times. a quick background before I answer your question directly, if I may. I was influenced heavily by the work of a gentleman named Colonel Eric Kale. And Colonel Kale taught at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. He was teaching future leaders of our country how to operate in times where things weren't necessarily straightforward. And Colonel Kale is known for introducing a theory of thinking called VUCA, V-U-C-A. And VUCA stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And Colonel Kale's point to those future soldiers, men and women, was gone are the times where we can sort of figure out when X happens, Y is our response. We live in a time where things just change so rapidly that we have to have principles by which to base our decisions on. And so that had a tremendous influence on me as I thought about how I was going to, sort of run or own the rest of my career. And so as I take risk, when I look at where my next opportunity is going to come from, it really comes down to what do I hold to be true and what are things that are non-negotiable for me. And there's really three things. The first is integrity. I will always operate with integrity first and always. There's no way I'm going to compromise that, period, end of statement. And that's built upon some of the stories I just shared, right, in terms of where these decisions have been made and exactly how they have panned out for me. The second is intentionality. I believe in the rule of 168, which if you're not familiar with it, is the number of hours we have in a week. Nobody gets any more and nobody gets any less. And I treat those hours like currency. I wouldn't waste $168 a week, so I'm not going to waste 168 hours of time. And so for me to show up at a job and to really contribute, I want to feel like what I'm doing matters. And I want to feel like I'm able to give back to an organization, but I'm also able to take something away. And that something has to be more than just a paycheck for me. It has to be a sense of commitment. It has to be a sense of contribution. It has to be a sense of I'm making a material difference either to the company or more importantly for me is to the people that I'm working with, be they clients or coworkers. And then the last one, again, probably not a surprise based on what we've talked about so far, is a willingness to stand up to power. I'm not someone who is capable of being pushed around. I've heard before that if you overplay a strength, it becomes a liability. So that may apply to me, but it's just not something I'm willing to negotiate. So as I look at career and I look at risk, I use those three things as a guide and say, what can I accomplish in this particular role? How will this help me achieve the thing I don't know enough about, going back to why I'm more than willing and have in many cases applied for jobs that I wasn't fully qualified for because I'm always looking to learn. That's probably the number one thing for me. There's two lists in my world, Simone. There's things I've done and there's things I haven't done yet. I do not have a things I cannot do list. And there are many things that would fall into that bucket. Like I cannot ballroom dance, much to my wife's dismay. I cannot juggle. And I'm really not very good playing musical instruments, despite years of trying to play a saxophone back in the day. But sans those three, I'm pretty much open to anything and everything. And I'm willing to take a risk that sort of pushes me into new boundaries and allows me to live a life that's based on those values.
Beautifully stated, beautifully stated. I love that we keep going back to the place of values and that they're non-negotiable. I love that's part of your equation as you think about opportunities for your career. Tell me, Dan, what is your formula for owning your career?
So I think for me, owning career really comes down to a couple different things. It comes down to the values that I just talked about.
Hmm.
It comes down to the role of education, and that doesn't have to be formal. It can very much be informal. And on the note of AI, I just want to go back to that for a moment. There are great resources on places like Coursera, and perhaps even Khan Academy, where you don't have to pay money to learn some of these things, where you have to pay a minimal amount. I would always encourage people to look at your current employer and figure out if there is continuing education or training budget that's available and take advantage of that. That's money on the table. We all can have our careers taken away from us pretty much at any moment, right? In this country, in the United States, we primarily work at will. But the one thing that someone can never take away from us is our education and our experience. So take advantage of that. Take advantage of those education dollars and learn constantly. The third thing in sort of owning, when I think about the formula for owning career, is something I call, so don't allow an output from process A to not be used as an input for process B. And what I mean by that is if I go through a particular job and I learn a particular skill, I'm going to take those skills that I didn't have before I started that particular role, and I'm going to apply them as a way of getting my next role or getting my next opportunity. And in such a way, we create what Jeff Bezos and Amazon would probably call a virtuous flywheel. And I think that's a great image that sort of stands in stark contrast to a vicious cycle, right? The virtuous flywheel allows us to continue to build leverage to do things that are more accurate or faster, depending on what our goal is, and allows us to get out of the perhaps vicious cycle that many of us, including myself, have found ourselves in. We're doing the same thing doesn't make any particular change in the outcome. We're doing the same thing only leads to greater frustration. It's that virtuous flywheel of how do I take the output from process A and make it an input for process B? What is the role of education, both formally and informally in our lives? How do we take those values that are important to us and put them to work every day? And then finally, going back to the rule of 168, how do we spend the most important currency we have, which is time and attention? We can spend that sitting hour after hour. As I tell my kids, you can get a job or you can, scroll Instagram, which pays exactly $0 an hour, right? We have time and we decide through where we put our time and attention what is important to us. And for me, that's a constant yearning to try and figure out something new and to learn something that I don't quite understand yet.
Love that about choices. Although I did think, the influencer thing, the next generation is in a different place about social media. Let me just say that. What, Dan, are your thoughts on if you were to put your entire career body of work to date together, what title would surface to summarize your career? What would the title be?
Probably chief protagonist.
Ooh.
And I say that because I'm always interested in being creatively disruptive, right? I don't want to be another cog in the wheel. I want to solve complex problems and I want to bring a unique perspective to the table that others around me just don't have. And I'm okay with the fact that not everybody wants to agree with that. I'm okay with the fact that that may end my current career a little prematurely because at the end of the day, I want to sign off every day or I want to come home every day and know that I made a dent in the universe. And it's the kind of dent that I wanted to make, that I didn't just sit there idle and allow somebody else to sort of, pull the strings, as it were.
Where did this courage and determination and integrity come from, Dan?
I think part of it is upbringing. I was raised by a very loving, family, mom and dad, very blue collar family. My dad was a firefighter and a carpenter. My mom was a stay-at-home mom for me and my two brothers, and then a lunch aide in the local high school. And what we learned early on is we didn't have a lot in terms of money or in terms of physical things. But what I learned early on was the value of relationships over the value of things. And so that was strengthened when I went to a high school. I went to a Jesuit Catholic military high school. So if you think about that combination, it was a school that my dad took a third job in order to afford to sort of send me to. And it was that grounding, if you will, in those principles where I realized, you know what, this is my life and I can do with it within reason what I want. And I don't have to live the script that somebody else may have had in place of or in mind for me. I think a lot of that was strengthened by some of the work that I did at the University of Pennsylvania, where I learned how to be more forthright in my thinking, where I learned how to be more comfortable with who I was. And I learned that every one of us has something to give if only we have the sort of courage to speak up and offer what it is that we think is needed in the world, not necessarily expected in the world.
What a beautiful sentiment to end our time together, which I don't want to end, by the way. This is a masterclass in career strategy, and I want to thank you so much for being on the podcast today and sharing so much nuggets of wisdom with our audience. Dan, if people want to stay connected with you, how can they do so?
Yeah, same here, Simone. Thank you for having me. I really do appreciate the opportunity. You can find me on LinkedIn. I'm Dan Castle, or Castle Dano, for those that know the reference from back in the day. Or that's probably the best way to find me, or you can reach out via mail at castled@gmail.com. Those are probably the two best ways to keep in touch.
Well, thank you so much for being a guest on the Power of Owning Your Career podcast, Dan Castle. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Simone, and have a wonderful day.
You too. Awesome.
That's it for today's empowering episode. I'm Simone E. Morris, and I want you to remember that you are indeed the architect of your career. Share this episode if it sparked something in you. Subscribe wherever you listen and find more resources at SimoneMorrisEnterprises.org. Keep practicing career ownership, and I'll be right here with you next week for more transformation.